come join me for a day spent in the kitchen, recipe testing a few recipes for the blog and trying to photograph them. Today I'm working on recipe testing for pumpkin sourdough muffins, and my sourdough starter is actually pretty young. I started it probably about 2 months ago now, and at our old house I previously had one, but during our move and renovation we didn't have one. We ended up throwing it away because I just could not keep it alive anymore. It had been like a year and a half, so I just started fresh, and so I'm trying to build it back up. Whenever I'm recipe testing, I like to just keep it super simple, and so on this day I was using my zucchini muffin recipe that I shared earlier in the summer, and I had just taken out the regular flour. That instead of adding flour, I just substituted that for the sourdough starter, and then obviously took out the zucchini and used pumpkin instead, and added the spices that you typically see with pumpkin, so things like cinnamon, vanilla, nutmeg, and allspice, and these turned out so good. But I started with a super small batch, so I only made 3 muffins at first, just because I wanted to make sure the texture and the taste was right, and then later in this video I make a full batch of them. The final recipe that I ended up coming up with, which this will be on the blog if you just want to jump over to the blog, I'll have that link down below. That way you can print out the recipe there for free. But it is 1 1/3 cup of starter, 1 cup of pumpkin, 1 cup sugar, 1/4 cup of lard melted, and you can use vegetable oil or Crisco. I know everybody likes to use something different. We just like to stick with lard. And then 2 eggs, 1 1/2 teaspoons of vanilla, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, 2 teaspoons of cinnamon, 1/2 teaspoon of nutmeg, and then 1/2 teaspoon of allspice. And just mix all that up and then bake it in your oven at 350, and I believe I baked mine for 35 minutes if I remember right. After I got my test batch made and out of the oven, I did go ahead and taste them once they cooled, and that's whenever I mixed up my full batch of the new pumpkin muffins. But I will say the key to getting fluffy sourdough muffins is to make sure you are starting with an active starter. If you do this with discard, they're not going to rise near as much, and also to not overmix your batter. So whenever you put your sourdough into your bowl, you're gonna see some air bubbles and stuff, and you don't want to like whisk it super hard. So I like to almost fold in my dough. As you can tell from these clips I took, I was trying to mix the pumpkin with the sourdough starter. I was trying to not bust all the air bubbles, because those are what do help you get the fluffy muffins that you want. But you totally can do this recipe with discard. You just got to know that they are not going to rise near as much as if they are starting out with an active starter. After I got the second batch of the sourdough pumpkin muffins mixed up, then I went ahead and started cleaning up the kitchen so that I could go ahead and start on dinner. Tonight we're going to be having a chicken pot pie. But before I started on dinner, I needed to go out and check on Ben, because we are harvesting our corn this same day. So Ben is actually out in the field right now with the tractor and the corn picker and one of our gravity wagons, and he is actually harvesting our corn for us right now. But it's going to take 2 weeks to get it done, just because this week we have to fill up one of the gravity wagons and get that corn ground and made into feed. And then once the wagon is empty, then we'll be able to harvest our next load. Just because we only have 1 gravity wagon, we really need 2, but we can make 1 work for now, just because we do not have the money to go get another one, so we just kind of have to make it work. So it does take a little bit longer, because the actual picking corn is super fast and takes no time at all. But whenever we have to grind it into feed, that does take a little bit of time. And then also just trying to fill up the bags and find somewhere to store it, because you want to store it properly so that it doesn't go bad. So we're trying to figure out how to store it all through winter so that we can feed it to all the animals. Last summer we actually bought a grain bin, and it's not set up yet on the property, but we're trying to work on getting that set up. But we're not sure how to get the feed from the gravity wagon into the grain bin, just because right now we're borrowing somebody else's mixer to mix our own feed and the grinder, so we don't have a way to actually get it to the top of the grain bin, if that makes sense. And then we would have to hook up our auger, but we're trying to get it all figured out. It just may take a little bit of time, but the faster we can get it done, then the faster we can get back to renovations. So if there are just a few recipe videos and stuff in between, then you know that we're still working on our corn. After I finished cleaning the kitchen, I went out to go check on Ben, and he was doing just fine. He'd almost got the gravity wagon full, and I took a few pictures of the dogs. They were out there with him while he was picking corn. There's Copper and Merle in the back, and then up close picture of Copper. He just always poses for me. While I was out there with Ben, he told me that we were going to go ahead and go grind this load of feed tonight. So I needed to hurry up and get dinner made so that we could leave as soon as possible so that we wouldn't have to do it in the dark. And so I decided on chicken pot pie. So I went ahead and started mixing up the first pie crust, and this is not a sourdough recipe, it's just a basic recipe. But I just use 1 cup of flour, 1 teaspoon of salt, half a cup of lard, and do not melt the lard, you just want it already just room temperature, and a 1/4 cup of water, which I just get mine straight from the tap. I don't worry about it being ice cold or anything like that. But if you don't have lard or Crisco, you can also use butter, and some people like to use butter just for flavor, but we actually prefer lard over butter. This recipe is also already on my blog, so I'll link it down below if you just want to get the free printable of it. But right here, you just add the lard in, and then I actually use my hands for this entire process. It just comes together a lot easier, I think, with my hands than instead of using a fork or something. But I just squeeze the dough until it starts to get crumbly, and you just are essentially cutting in the lard with your fingertips. And if you start to get a big clump, just go ahead and separate it into little pieces. This is how you'll get your flakiness. Once you get it cut together and you have all the little crumble pieces, then you'll start to slowly add in your 1/4 cup of water. And sometimes you'll use the whole 1/4 cup, and then sometimes you don't. I don't know what the rhyme or reason is for this because I use the same recipe every time, but each time I always use a different amount of flour. This day I only used probably 1/8 of a cup of water, and it came together perfectly. So just judge it as you go, and as soon as it starts to form into a ball, you know you're ready. You don't want your dough to be wet looking. You just want it to come together into a ball. Flour your workspace, and then you're going to start rolling your dough, but you want to make sure that you generously flour your rolling pin, and as you go, you'll probably have to continue adding flour to your rolling pin because any wet spots in the dough are going to take the flour off of your rolling pin, and which is completely fine. You just want to make sure that your dough is not sticking to your rolling pin. So as I'm doing this, I'll re-flour my rolling pin multiple times. Continue rolling out your dough in opposite directions until you get a somewhat circle, and it doesn't have to be perfect. Just roll it out larger than your pie crust, that way you can cut away any of the extra. And I don't mind wasting the extra. It's not waste because I always give it to our chickens and they absolutely love it, especially in the wintertime when there's not as many bugs and stuff going on right now. So where it's fall, they absolutely love the pie crust or any scraps that I give them. After you drape the pie crust over top of your pie pan, then go ahead and take a knife and trim around all the edges. After you cut away all the extra, take a fork and poke holes in the bottom of your pie crust. I like to do this just because I think it cooks way more evenly and it prevents any air bubbles that may form in the bottom of your pie crust. When I'm making my pie filling, I like to take a cast iron skillet and go ahead and get it preheating over medium heat. And I'll put just the smallest amount of oil or lard in the bottom of the skillet, and I diced up a medium-sized onion and then also peeled a medium-sized potato and diced it up as well, and add it to the cast iron skillet to go ahead and start cooking. Earlier in the week I had made a rotisserie chicken. We finally finished out all of our meat birds, and our freezer is now full of meat for the year, so we have plenty of chicken to get us through winter now. But I made a rotisserie chicken out of one of them, and I put it all in this bowl, and I'll just pull it out for recipes throughout the week. So I'm using one of the breast right here, and I'm cutting it into chunks. We actually prefer chunks in our chicken. I know chunks is a weird word, but instead of shredding it, but if you want to shred yours, you can easily throw it in the mixer or shred it by hand. But once you get your chicken however you like it, then go ahead and add it to your cast iron skillet so it can start heating up. As far as vegetables go for your chicken pot pie, you can put in canned vegetables, whatever you have on hand, or fresh vegetables. I just had this frozen bag of vegetables in the freezer that needed used. It'd been in there for quite a while, and I was afraid it was going to go freezer burnt. So instead of using our fresh canned vegetables from the garden, I am going to go ahead and use this up first, but just go ahead and mix that up and let those vegetables start cooking as well. Next, I'm going to go ahead and start working on our roux, and I was going to use that cream of chicken, but I opened it up and it did not look good. So I just tossed it, and I'm going to make a homemade roux. So what I added was a half cup of organic chicken broth or bone broth, whatever you have. I just don't have any more canned bone broth. I've used it all this summer. And you're going to add in your flour. I added a little bit too much flour. I think I put half a cup. I probably should have went with about a third a cup. But just continue whisking it over high heat until it starts to thicken. And once it's thickened, then add salt and pepper and just add it into your chicken and vegetable mixture. And then it is ready to put into your pot pie. So take your pie crust, and you can either bake your pie crust beforehand or after. I prefer to do it after, just because I think it absorbs a little bit of the flavor of the chicken, if that makes sense. So I just filled up my pie crust. When you're adding your filling, it's going to look like so much filling and your pie crust just will not hold it, but just add it all and it works out every time. The mixture does cook down. Now it is time to make the second pie crust, and I use the same exact recipe, same exact method, everything as before. And like I said, this recipe is on my blog, so you can click the link below to get this pie crust recipe. What I love about this pie crust is how versatile it is. I use this pie crust for all of my pies, including my sweet pies. So if I'm making an apple pie or peach pie, anything, I'll add a tablespoon of sugar whenever I'm mixing my dough up, and then I do everything else the exact same. Unroll your pie crust over top of your pie, and then you're going to remove the excess over the edges. So use the same knife and cut the extra away, and you can feed this for scraps. Like I said, our chickens and pigs actually love it, so don't waste it, but just give it to your animals. And then use a fork to poke down the edges. You can also use your fingers if you'd rather just crimp the edges closed, but you do need to seal your pie up. So I like to take a fork and go all the way around the edges and do this, and then use a knife to cut vents in the top of your pie. Some people can cut a really cute design. I just stick with super simple straight lines, and it ends up looking like a star. So I do 4 big long lines, and then in between each of those I do a shorter line. I hope that makes sense. And then mix up an egg wash. So this is an egg yolk, and it is about a tablespoon of milk, and you're just going to whisk it up together and brush your entire pie with it. This is optional, you don't have to do it. This is just how you can get a really golden crust, and it ends up looking really nice. Before I start cleaning up for the evening, I go ahead and feed my sourdough starter so that it'll be ready to use tomorrow. And I do not really measure anything with my sourdough starter. I know a lot of people like to use scales and know the hydration of their starter and everything, but I just do not do that. It requires too much thinking and too much time, honestly. My sourdough starter is just a hobby for me, and mostly we use it for pancakes, and I have still not been able to make a loaf of bread out of my starter yet. It's just not strong enough. And like I said, it's been almost 2 months, so I am working on building that up. But the best way to do that is to continue to make recipes with your starter. So that's why I made the pumpkin muffins today, to just continue to use that, and that way you're not throwing away discard and things like that. I don't really care to do that, but you can also put your discard into the refrigerator if you don't want to get rid of it, and it'll keep in the fridge for a week. So every day that you discard, you can just continue to add to it, but you want to make sure that you're using your discard. If you're putting it in their fridge, you'll want to actually use it. I wanted to make a topping for my pumpkin sourdough muffins, so I ended up making a cream cheese sort of frosting. So I used 1 whole block of cream cheese softened, probably about half a cup of powdered sugar, and then probably 1 to 2 teaspoons of vanilla. I can't really remember how much I used. And then I put in just a splash of lemon juice just to kind of cut it, and it turned out so good. But I didn't have any piping bags, so I just used a Ziploc bag that I had on hand, and I pushed all the cream cheese frosting down to one side, and just cut the corner of the bag and use that as my piping bag to go ahead and pipe the frosting onto the muffins. To me, these ended up tasting almost exactly like a pumpkin roll. And on Ben's, I did leave off the cream cheese just because he does not like cream cheese frosting at all. So I just left his plain, but he actually loved them. He actually hates anything sourdough. So I didn't tell him that they were sourdough, but he tried them and said that they were actually really good and that they weren't even sour at all. So that is a plus in my book because he is finally eating some things that are sourdough without knowing it. And these are some of the pictures that I ended up taking for the blog. But that is it for this video. So thank you guys so much for watching and spending the day in the kitchen with me. But I hope you guys will like and subscribe.